Hey class, welcome to chapter 14, section 1. In this section, we're looking at the primary differences between the North and the South. We've been looking at differences with them for the last 150, 200 years, ever since they came to America. Just the way the geography has made these two groups different. As you know, the South is very agricultural, all kinds of farming. There are relatively few towns, few villages, and very few cities in the South. The cities that were there were along the coast, mainly for shipping reasons. And instead of factories, they had large plantations. Those large plantations, they raised cash crops like cotton. And they made them, of course, for sale, and they made huge amounts of money on these plantations with the help of slaves growing crops like cotton. And the economy in the southern cities revolved around the sale and trade of agricultural products. The cities they did have weren't full of factories and industry, but rather they were there to trade and sell the crops gathered by the slaves on plantations. And I've given you this map here to give you a bit of a visual of what we're talking about when we say the South. On the very top end here we have Maryland and Virginia, all the way south into the west to Texas. Plantation owners, though, made up a very small percentage of the South. Just about 1% were actually plantation owners. But that 1% were the upper class. They were the political, social, and economic leaders, and they by far owned the most slaves. Actually, most Southerners did not own slaves. Only about 1/4 owned slaves. And of the 1/4, most of them only had 5 or 7 slaves. It was only about 5% of that 1% that would have owned 50 or more slaves. It was a very small number. The North, as you know, was very different, of course. The North has very few slaves, and instead of having a lot of agriculture, they relied primarily on factories. It had a lot of cities that were crowded and noisy, and the North is growing fast. Not growing fast because of slaves, but because of immigrants. Immigrants are flocking to America, and they're coming to fill those factory jobs. There wasn't any work for them in the South because the South used slaves. They were cheaper for them. More than 2.8 million immigrants were coming to America during this time, and of those 2.8 million, 7/8 of them, or 87% of them, would settle in the North. Notice the North here on this map. It's more than just New England now. It's also part of this Western territory, that Ohio, Michigan, Illinois area. So all of that makes up the North. Most of the population owned small farms, were merchants, or worked in factories. Now you're thinking, I just told you they weren't agricultural. They weren't. They didn't have the big plantations, but most people were still what we'd call a subsistent farmer. They farmed just enough for their own family's survival. Of all of the factories in America, 80% of them are in the North. 80% all in the North. And while plantation owners in the South made up kind of the upper class, the most influential people in the North, the most influential were the factory owners, the railroad owners, and other kind of business and industry leaders made up kind of the upper class of the South, of the North. Another major difference between the North and the South was how they viewed government. The North favored a strong central government. When we say central, we mean national government, like out of Washington, D.C. The North was also more willing to pay high taxes to provide for local goods and state goods and services. They were okay paying money to build roads and bridges and schools. The South, though, was afraid that a strong national government would weaken them. And they believed that the best government was a local government. governed just by their own state and not by the national government. The South also didn't really pay taxes for services like education or improvements or benefits to society. They didn't want to spend money on those kinds of things. They wanted to keep it. Where the North, again, was willing to pay money for internal improvements, for education, and so forth. The North believed that the Constitution was the nation's highest law and believed that it had the authority over any of these state governments. The national law had authority over Missouri, over any state, right? You pick. The Constitution, the national government, the North believed, had authority over the states. Southerners believed, though, that the federal government could not overrule the rights of the states. They believed the states had more authority. So if we're going to divide them up real quick, it would look like this. The North favored the strong national government. The North believed the Constitution was the highest law, while the South believed the states were the highest authority, and the national government couldn't tell them what to do. The South believed that states had the right to nullify laws they didn't like. And if you recall even things like the tariffs, right? The North was favored that. They thought it was beneficial to pay that tax. The South, of course, hated it. But the major political issue that continues to rule life is states' rights, but then the slavery issue. And who had the right to determine slavery? Right now, states had that right. The North had said no to it, South had said yes to it. But we're about to hit a boiling point where the issue is no more compromises to be made, and we're on the verge now, of course, of real conflict because these two regions, North and South, are so different from each other.